Okay, well, welcome everyone. I am Chris Volparo. I'm on the graduate faculty of the PhD program in interdisciplinary studies here at Union Institute and University, and I'm affiliated with the Institute for Social Justice. We are very pleased to have as our guest today, Dr. Paul Taylor, who is the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Professor of African American and Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt University. Among other areas, he specializes in the philosophy of race and race theory. And in addition to many books and articles, he is author of Race, a Philosophical Introduction, which now is in its third edition. Well, welcome, Professor Taylor.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, so let's get right into it. As you note in your book, all of us develop a practical understanding of race and what we mean by it through navigating the world. Yet, as soon as we try to pin down definitions and answer any of the vexing questions, we find ourselves in a conceptual muddle pretty quickly. So I think we can just start with our question, what is race?
That is a very good question to get us launched here. I'm going to defer answering it very briefly, just to dwell for a moment on the setup that you offered us, right? So there's a way in which race talk is not interestingly different from any other kind of talk, right? We argue about the meanings of all kinds of concepts. People get confused and use words in different ways. That's a perfectly straightforward and fairly common feature of human social interaction and human communication. So to some degree, this is familiar. The thing with race is that it raises the stakes of that basic feature of human interaction and human social life and human communication in really striking ways that are striking in part because they've had such a profound influence on human life over the last several centuries. So I want to put that in the background because it will frame the kind of answer I give to your question. Finally, to answer the question, what is race? Different things to different people, different things in different contexts. And so the kind of I want to be clear about the kind of answer I give. It's an answer that comes from the perspective of social theory. This is the kind of answer one gives when one is trying to refine ordinary language or vernacular languages to tease out some conceptual resources that allow us to make sense of the world. I'm not trying to do what the dictionary people do and tell you what people actually mean in the world by it. Some people will mean what I'm about to say, but I'm offering you a social theoretic concept that allows us to map the terrain in something like the way sociologists do and social anthropologists do. End of preamble. Race is a principle of social differentiation. It is one of many such principles: class, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. It's a principle that functions by appeal to a very specific mechanism. Unlike class, unlike ethnicity, unlike gender, it's a principle of social differentiation that assigns generic meanings to human bodies and bloodlines. It's a principle of social differentiation that it privileges judgments about human appearance and ancestry to sort people into categories that we then do things with. Now, different people do different things with them. The problem with race is that most often people do horrible things with them. People like me want to keep talking about race in part because the horrible things have created social patterns that it will pay us to track, and we can use the language of race to continue to track those patterns and to push back on the horrible things.
Thank you. There's a lot there. Excellent. But clearly the assigning of generic meaning to human bodies and bloodlines, gives us this working definition. And I like the way that you refer to race talk, hyphenated, as a way of keeping words and things or entities, connected. Because we know from some of our philosophical background that that's how language works. But it always leaves the question then as a follow-up: do races exist? Are they real? Are they arbitrary, fictions that are constructed in certain contexts in order to to do those bad things that you refer to? How do we answer that question?
Another hard question. The topic of race is full of hard questions, or routinely generates hard questions. Sometimes people say arbitrary when they mean contingent. Something is, so I want to draw that distinction because it's an important one. I don't think race is arbitrary at all, right? So when people in place, so one thing to say about race is that people do the work of social differentiation that I described earlier differently in different places. And so there are places that have schemes of race thinking that look very familiar to people in places like the United States, right? But then there are other forms of race thinking in other places. If by asking whether race exists, one means to ask whether the populations that are sorted by appeal to certain principles of social differentiation in particular contexts exist, then yes, of course they do. That's what sociologists study, and that's how we know there's social stratification, and wealth is unequally distributed and all that. So the populations exist, right? Whether one wants to use race talk to talk about them is dependent on some other kinds of considerations, right? Some people think you can use race talk perfectly straightforward ways to track those patterns and talk about the social inequities and so forth. Other people think the language gets in the way. And so whether you think the thing the language points to is real will depend on your judgments about how to effectively navigate the social landscape and how to use conceptual resources productively for that purpose. I think one can say with perfect, I keep saying perfectly straightforward. That's probably not the thing to keep saying in this context. I think it's pretty easy to say just, there are patterns in the world that we need to attend to, and race talk helps us track those patterns in useful ways. Therefore, race exists. I'm building in lots of things there. People have different ideas about what it takes for something to be real. That's my bar. So for the philosophy nerds out there who remember like late 90s Daniel Dennett, I'm a moderate instrumentalist about things, about social entities. So I want to go back to the distinction between arbitrary and contingent. So the social patterns are deeply grooved in our society. They have deep historical causes, right? There are deep and abiding contextual forces that bring them into being and sustain them. Race is contingent on all of that, but it's not arbitrary, right? I can't just walk in a room and say, I'm a white guy. I can't, because that's not how the language works. So it's not arbitrary, but it's deeply contingent, right? It's not written into the structure of the universe. God didn't come down and say there will be races. So it's contingent, but it's not arbitrary.
Important distinction, yes. And that ties into the context dependence of these assigned meanings, right? And sometimes this is the part that people find hard to get a handle on, is that the meaning of assigned to bodies in one context, perhaps, a group of Black folk talking with each other about race, is going to involve a very different set of valences in the meanings than a group of white folk talking about race. And we see this emerging, often unanticipated ways on social media, where the differences in those contexts really clash and lead to quite a bit of backlash, I think rightly in many cases. But when we try to determine, is race really real, how do we navigate that divergence in context while retaining the sense of the reality there?
We navigate it with difficulty and unevenly, and if we are not careful, sometimes violently. But the cure is a little strong, but you'll take the point. One remedy for that, one resource that helps us navigate that more effectively rather than less, involves a certain kinds of, a couple of things. One is a kind of cultural literacy, right? To understand, it is important for people in pluralist democracies to understand that they are in a community with lots of other people with different views and different ways of talking about things. And you have to cultivate the dispositions that allow you to move flexibly through that society. So there's a lot to say about that, but I'll just flag that as one piece of it. But another piece of it that bears on the earlier question you asked about whether race is real has to do with an interesting kind of metaphysical disappointment that people have when it comes to race, right? We live in a society that in certain ways was raised on the thought that race is immutable and is written into the structure of things, right? And then we realize, well, that's garbage, that's false, that's obviously false. And whipsawing from this sort of fundamentalism about human bodies and stuff to this sort of ungrounded space left people sort of rudderless. And like, well, if it can't be deeply objective the way rocks are, then it can't be anything. And you shouldn't hold me accountable for the way I talk about something that can't be anything, right? Which is why it's important, in my view, to say all of the things I was saying earlier, right? It's not arbitrary, but it's contingent, it's real, it tracks real things in the world. And so there's something happening in social life that makes demands on us, that makes claims on us, even though it doesn't do it the way rocks and trees do, right? And so sometimes some of the social, the wrinkles, the difficulties in our social interactions that you're pointing to come from a very deeply rooted impulse people have to think, well, it's not really anything, right? And so I don't have to attend to it or navigate it safely or carefully. No, it's something, but it's not like rocks and trees. And so we need to be very careful about how we deal with it. I'll say one more thing. I know I'm going on a little bit. For me, it's helpful to think of race in by comparison with other kinds of social facts and social realities, right? We use money. Somebody invented money at some point, right? God didn't say, here's your money. We decided, here's money, and we're going to do stuff with it. We're going to decide that certain kinds of objects count for certain units of value, and we make lots of decisions. And then real things happen when we do that. Race is like that.